Thanks, Austin, for that fascinating tip talk. Those technologies and all new technologies depend upon the certainty of a strong and dependable domestic supply chain. This has been a challenging year for supply chains in general. It's triggered a new look at what all stakeholders need to do to ensure auto production remains robust. Carla Bailo of the Center for Automotive Research now takes us through a discussion on the current semiconductor shortage, what it means for production, and what supply chain disruptions in general could mean to the auto industry's future. Carla?
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone to our panel entitled Stronger Links, Seeking Resiliency in Supply Chains. Today we're discussing an important and extremely timely subject, the resiliency of the American automotive supply chain. It's a topic that's gotten a lot of attention over the past year as consumer demand related to the COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters, and other factors have led to an automotive chip shortage across the globe. While the auto industry continues to work with policymakers across the aisle to address this issue, it's coming to a head at a critical time when America is making a transition to cleaner, safer, and smarter transportation. Due to this shortage, auto manufacturers have seen delays in the production of vehicles currently on the market and potential delays in the coming months of vehicles that they had been eager to introduce. Addressing this current situation resulting in supply chain constraints must remain a top priority. As electric vehicles set to play an important role in the transportation of transportation, understanding these constraints and working to develop a more robust U.S. supply chain for electric vehicles will be especially important, given the auto industry's commitment to ensuring that 40 to 50% of new cars sold by 2030 will be electrified models. So how can we navigate the situation to both mitigate the impact of current disruption to the supply chain and position the U.S. supply base for continued success moving forward? We're joined by a panel of experts to unpack this topic further. First, Ellen Hughes Cromwick is a senior resident fellow for the Climate and Energy Program at the think tank Third Way. Prior to her role at Third Way, Hughes Cromwick served as the global chief economist at Ford Motor Company and chief economist at the Department of Commerce during the Obama administration. We're also joined by John Neufer, president and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association. He represents the voice of the semiconductor industry and leads the association's policy advocacy in Washington and capitals around the world. John also serves as a member of the board of directors of the Semiconductor Research Corporation, the world's leading nonprofit industry, government, academia, microelectronics research consortium. Finally, we have Robbie Diamond here with us. He's the CEO and president of Securing America's Future Energy, better known as SAFE, which aims to advance transformative transportation and mobility technologies. Diamond helped found the Electrification Coalition and serves on the board of Rhombus Energy Solutions. Thank you all for joining us today. So with that introduction, I'd like to hand it over to each panelist to give us maybe 2 or 3 opening comments, and then I'll dig right into the questions that we have ready to go. I'll send it to Ellen first for any introductory comments related to this topic.
Thank you, Carla, for that introduction. We do have tremendous opportunities in the automotive industry as we look out over the next 10 years. And the supply chain, the critical component of that growth. Here in the US, we need to build our supply chain for the future of electric vehicles and generate a great foundation for reducing emissions in our transportation sector. I think our manufacturers are up to the task, and I'm really looking forward to talking about these issues in the panel.
Thank you, Ellen. And John, do you have some overarching comments for us before we dig in?
Sure, Carla. Just thanks very much for the invitation to speak here. Delighted to do it. Just a couple of things building on what Helen just said. It just become very obvious with the pandemic that we need to work much harder to make our supply chains more resilient. Clearly, we're seeing acute shortages in the auto industry for chips. But the other thing, when we're talking about EVs, we're just going to see a whole lot more chip content going into cars. The chips going into EVs are going to be many in number, and even for internal combustion engines, we're seeing a lot more demand for chips. And I think that's kind of what's happening right now. Like so many trends, the pandemic has been an accelerant, and I think it's created an environment where a lot more consumers, including auto companies, are using more and more chips.
Thank you, John. And Robbie, do you have a couple overarching points you'd like to add?
Thank you so much for having me. I think it's great to follow a leading expert in the semiconductor field and advocacy, because the semiconductor shortage and what it's done is really the canary in the coal mine, or the mine. And it's the mine of all the minerals we're going to need for an EV future, from the lithium to the nickel to the cobalt to the manganese to the graphite to the rare earths. And most of these all go through China at one point or another. And the diplomatic relationship with China is weak, as we see, and it's tying together this sort of diplomatic grievance list. And I feel that the auto sector, that's always been sort of held to this dependence on oil as the only transportation fuel, which has led both our foreign policy and also our economic devastation of the companies themselves as oil prices went up. We can't go from that dependence to a new dependence on all these minerals. So the supply chain issues as we make this transition are critical. And we just see it now with semiconductors, and it's going to grow in every area as we transition this sector.
Thank you, Robbie. And interestingly enough, last night the CAR group held a affiliates gathering, and we had a couple of our congresspeople from Michigan present, and they said over and over again how important it is for us to bring these products onto our shores. So keeping that in mind, you know, what we've seen through the pandemic, John, I want to start with you. We've seen massive supply chain disruptions, not just semiconductors, but many parts, our food supply, everything seems to be disrupted these days. You know, how can we use some of these lessons, you know, that we're learning and create a more resilient, more robust supply chain in general?
Great question. That's the $1 million question, I think. I think there's three, to state the obvious, like there's three things we need to be looking at. One is, you know, the auto industry and others have perfected the art of just-in-time delivery supply chain approaches. And I think that one thing we've seen with this pandemic is that needs to be balanced more effectively with just-in-case approaches, so that the sole focus is not just timeliness, but also resiliency in terms of our supply chains. The other thing is to build stronger resilience, long-term contracts. You know, the semiconductor industry makes huge investments in its fabs, up to $20 billion for a single fab. And as it's making those investments, it wants assurance that it's going to have customers. And a lot of people across the supply chain, other sectors, have long-term contracts with us, and it's worked very well. And I think that would alleviate going forward some of the potential risks with disruptions like we're seeing. And then finally, to state the obvious, we just need to do more to diversify our supply chains, spread the risk around. Happy to talk about this later, but Congress is very focused on that when it comes to the semiconductor industry. One of the problems we face is that we don't produce as many chips here on U.S. shores as we used to. In 1990, we produced about 37% of chips globally for the global supply. Now it's down to about 12%. And so Congress is looking at this, looking at some legislation to help level the playing field here and create incentives to get more chip manufacturing happening on U.S. shores.
Thanks, John. And can you just illuminate, why does it take so dang long to make a semiconductor factory?
Chips, well, I'll say two things. One, factories are huge, very complex, just kind of the most complex machines that mankind makes. So it takes a long time to build them, 2 to 4 years. The chips themselves, up to 6 months. Again, chips are just kind of breathtakingly complicated in their architecture and design and the materials they use, and it takes months for some chips to get through the fabs from start to finish, and that's just the reality. One thing in times of scarcity, and this I heard this recently, fabs have four walls. These manufacturing facilities have four walls, so you can only do so much in those four walls. And we're running at full capacity now. We've been doing that for more than a year, beyond full capacity, and it's just going to take a certain amount of time to complete the fabs that are already under construction and to build more fabs.
Thanks, John. And Ellen, when we look at, what the big risks in our supply chain today, can you, expand on that a little bit and what, your organization and what you're hearing in Washington to help alleviate some of these supply chain issues?
Sure. I think one important observation is that supply chains are a team sport. It's not really up to any individual company or industry. It is a combination of enabling policies from the federal government combined with company and industry actions. What we have now wending its way through Congress in the form of the bipartisan infrastructure package as well as upcoming budget reconciliation are a host of provisions that will significantly help the auto industry as it transitions to electric vehicles. As you know, at any given company, many different strategies are used to manage and be proactive about the supply chain. For example, feathering in physical contracts. Second, owning physical commodities, actually owning a mine, a lithium mine as an example. And thirdly, engineering and using financial contracts to help mitigate risk. I want to make a comment just to follow up that it's so important to recognize that any company can mitigate only so much supply chain risk. There are tail risks, and to mitigate those tail risks, for example, a pandemic, would be extremely costly. And again, I want to come back to the point that in order to really be proactive and long and patient with respect to capital allocated to building up the supply chain, we need to think about the team sport. And again, that federal funding to help build out and rejuvenate our domestic manufacturing to support this transition to electric vehicles is going to be absolutely critical. So these are important ingredients. We can do it. The US manufacturing sector has a legacy of talented workers and also knows how to use capital equipment effectively. So it will happen. It's just that we got a little bit caught with tail risk associated with the pandemic, as well as this more marked transition and accelerated transition to electric vehicles.
I absolutely love hearing about, it's a team effort. And, from someone who's worked with the automotive industry for a long, long time, there is definitely competition between each of the manufacturers. So, how to overcome that, I think, will be very important on the industry side. Robbie, as we transition into electric vehicles, and we're moving fast. Lots of dollars are being invested by the automakers. Almost daily, it seems there's a new announcement. What does that mean for the supply chain? What other elements do we need to be concerned about, as we move into this new era of electrification?
Right. So let's talk about the supply chain. I'm going to be more of the negative type on the panel. I think that there's sort of two issues. There's the amount of things we're going to need, and there's where those things come from. Both are huge, massive challenges I don't think anyone has begun to grapple with. Let's just take copper, for example, and the amount of copper that's in a car, and the amount of copper we're going to need for this transition. It's not a very, it's not a something we've never heard of. We're going to need about 2.5 times the amount of copper in the next 25 years than we've used in human history. Okay, and where are those copper mines coming from? We can't even open up one in Arizona in the United States. And this is going to go across the board. We only process 0 to 4% of the minerals that are needed in a lithium-ion battery. I mean, these are massive issues. And where are those being processed? So on the supply chain side, I think it's amazing that we hear these great announcements. And I do think that they're beginning to try to think to go up the chain. But right now, like, even if you get components coming for a battery facility, they're mostly the cells, the anodes, the cathodes are coming from other places. None are being made here. They're being assembled here. And where are those places? They're China, South Korea, or Japan. And many of those countries are actually sending them through China. So if one looks again at the geopolitical, both of geography and where these places are and how close they are to a competitive rival, and then one thinks about, our lack of control because they're making those decisions. We need to do much more to think through the entire supply chain, from the minerals, through the processing, through all the way to the markets. And if we don't, and we're not doing that with our techno-democracy allies, we will get caught again. And it's just, even not thinking through that whole China question is this massive, just amounts of things. And I don't know if our country really realized what it takes to reopen mines and to do all this here. And I think it's very close to semiconductors. I'll finish with this, which is, why does the government need to jump in to create these fabs through the CHIPS Act? It's because our country does not tend to do well, or our markets, with high cost, low margin businesses. And it costs a lot. And so we're going to have to do the same thing probably in processing in each of these areas. So are we mature enough to open the mines, and are we mature enough to pay some of these upfront costs? When we better be, or we will be caught again with these issues.
Carla, can I jump in there? Carla, can I jump in there and respond quickly to Robbie? Completely agree with him about the semiconductor point. When it comes to semiconductors, though, the big differentiator and the reason why there's not more fab construction here on U.S. shores is that there's massive incentives provided by central governments around the world in countries that build chips. That's the big differentiator, and that's what needs to be changed with federal incentives attached to the CHIPS Act. Until we get that cleared away, it's something like 40% more expensive to build a fab here in the U.S. than it is overseas, and it's mostly because of these incentives provided by central governments abroad. Our states do a little of that. Our federal government has not gotten into that business, and as a result, our competitors are halfway down the field, and we're standing on the start line.
Do you mind if I just join in on
Please
that?
go ahead.
I think this is a critical point, and why I emphasized in my intro remarks the importance of a team sport, that we need to think about this as a public-private enterprise. We're competing for the future of our country, given how far ahead Europe and China are with respect to EVs. And I want to point out as well, Robbie, that I remember at Ford when there were significant concerns around the supply of palladium. And what happened? Engineers innovated and reduced the requirements of palladium in the catalytic converter. I think we have to think broadly about innovation and technology advances that could actually engineer away the cobalt in the battery. I think we need to be open to all those potential outcomes and, really be aggressive. I agree with you on the mines, but we have to think about the fact that this technology is advancing and we're going to be the innovators.
Ellen, let me come back to you on that. I looked recently at data showing how much we're investing in research in our country versus China, and it's astonishing how low our numbers are. And many of our good researchers have left the United States to go to places that are funding their laboratories. How are policymakers addressing that fundamental issue? Because we need to support innovation and creativity and new ideas and get also that self-started mission as part of this initiative.
I hope everyone that's listening to this panel will say, I am all in on the bipartisan infrastructure and budget reconciliation, and also the appropriations process for the next fiscal year, because what is contained in all three of those are significant increases in appropriations for research, development, and demonstrations. And that will entice a lot of innovation here in the US. We have massive Department of Energy laboratories. We have a new supercomputer at Argonne National Lab that will be working on innovations around repurposing and recycling batteries. We've got to be all in. Anyone interested in this electric future and reducing CO2 emissions has to be supporting this kind of legislation. Otherwise, we will be in the back seat. As you know, CATL, one of the largest battery makers in China, essentially supplies half of the 6,000 new energy vehicles in China. What are they doing? They're innovating. They're funding scientists to innovate on their cell manufacturing. We have to do double, triple that. We've got to really move in. And it's not going to happen if we don't get the federal funding.
So can I just jump in there? Something like 3 in 4 postgraduate students in the U.S. are foreign-born, and that's great. Foreign-born talent is fantastic, but this trend continues. Fewer and fewer Americans are students are going into STEM. So there's that problem, and on the other side of that coin is that our immigration system is completely broken. We have all this foreign-born talent, and then when they get their degrees, they have to go home and work for competitors because it's so hard for them to stay here because of our visa problems. So we need to unlock this potential both domestically, and until we get more domestic talent, we need to ensure that the foreign grown talent is talent we can tap into.
Thanks, John. You know, we could do a whole panel just on talent and workforce. I know it, and it's a subject that I adore too. But Robbie, let me go back to you for a minute. You talked about mines and how difficult they are to reopen. We face the same thing here in Michigan. We had one of the largest copper mines up in the Upper Peninsula that's been closed for years, and talking about reopening it now will take many years because of environmental issues and safety issues. So as I hear about all of the different things that are being analyzed, I see this super long path. So, as Ellen was saying, should we start working with our allies closer that, Australia and others that already have mining operations, and, our stuff US can get on in due course, but I fear if we wait for what, reopening things in the US, that's a long wait and too much risk.
Right. So first, on just innovation, I have to deal with my one pet peeve, which is innovation, as Andy Grove said, once again, a great semiconductor hero, is how happens when you manufacture. And that is my concern about some bringing all these products in and then just assembling them here. We're not innovating. We are in the lab, but we're not necessarily through the process. And that's where CATL has done, so well. So I bring that up, that I don't think Americans think of innovation as manufacturing, but manufacturing itself brings the innovation. On what you said, which is really the core of what I would love to get across, is what we need to do now, both in the United States and with our allies, is to create a system that has resiliency and sustainability in our supply chain at its core, and not just about price. If we do not create a race to the top amongst us all, it will be a race to the bottom, and that is where China will win, and we will get ourselves into this deep dependence. See, opacity in the supply chain is the friend of China. Transparency in the supply chain and standards is the friend of the United States and hopefully our allies, right? We need environmental standards, we need human rights standards, and we have to have transparency from the minerals provenance all the way to the mine, all the way to the battery. Because if that happens, we will race to the top. And if we take Korea and Japan and Canada and Australia and Europe and ourselves, there are more cars outside of China than inside China. And, it can't be that a rare earth mineral turned into a permanent magnet creates a nuclear dump in a city in China and no one in the environmental community cares, because most of them probably don't know. So that is what we need to happen. We need to agree together at the same time. These are the standards, and put that transparency in. And I think that is how we win, because as we've seen, transparency is not what China wants at the moment. They will pull their companies off the stock exchange. All these issues now. And I really think we need to look, what is our weapon? And our weapon is that transparency and standards. And we should really embrace those, and I think the companies should embrace those, because they will ultimately, face decades down the road the problems if we don't do it.
And John, when we talk about electric vehicles and the number of chips that we're going to need, how do standards fit into that? There's been a lot of talk about, each company has their own standards, and therefore there's this complexity of chips that exists. Is there coordination starting, or at least being discussed, so that we can reduce that complexity and maybe do longer batch runs, or do something smarter in the way that we order and receive these products today?
Yeah, there's a couple of things here. I've heard auto experts say there should be kind of more simplification in the components, more standardization of the components. So there's not so much differentiation, which creates vulnerabilities in our supply chain. But one thing that the move towards electric vehicles is that it's going to bring in a whole generation of innovative new technologies from the chip sector. One of the problems that we have with the auto sector is a lot of the chip technologies are older technologies, and it would help kind of make the supply chain more resilient if there wasn't such a long tail in the legacy. And with that, it's a chance to reset at least a big part of the industry, to level up the level of semiconductor technology, and I think that will help make the supply chain more resilient.
So, Ellen, let's talk about the team sport again. As we need more and more chips, how can we work better with other countries and our allies, and really, create this robust, resilient, future-proof supply chain?
I think that we are on our way to doing that. We've seen some initiatives recently that really open up more avenues for our domestic manufacturers to partner with those in our ally countries, and we just have to keep moving on that. As you recall, during the Obama administration, there was a significant effort to push ahead on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Program, the TPP, and it did not pass Congress. That would have been a significant step forward in joining in with important allies to move those partnerships and expansion ahead. We need to go back and revisit that because, as you know, China recently is now trying to become a partner in TPP. That would be to our disadvantage. That isn't an area I'm doing research in right now, but when I was at Commerce, we worked significantly to show how important TPP was for exactly these issues, Carla.
Yeah, I did see recently that China was looking at joining TPP, and it made me a lot nervous, about how that would impact the U.S. even further. So we've talked a little bit about some of the federal funding that's in these current proposals. Is that enough? Do we need more? Do we need businesses to put in more, the private sector to put in more? I mean, I often see industry pointing at government, government points at industry. How can we, begin to work as a good solid team to be able to put, everyone's money on the table and make this happen?
Since there's $52 billion before Congress right now to incentivize chip manufacturing, let me just jump in. First of all, the chip industry is one of the most R&D intensive industries in the world. We're right up there with the pharmaceuticals. About $1 in $5 from sales is plowed back into R&D. So that's one of our big secrets to formula ingredients for success is we're so R&D intensive, and it's extremely expensive, becoming more expensive to create these chips that now have something like 35, 50 billion transistors on one little piece of. So we're already chipping in, no pun intended, or pun intended, an awful lot. And what the federal government is looking to do at $52 billion is a good first step. Now, again, that is necessary because it needs to bring us up in terms of federal incentives to close to what other governments are doing. And I think we're realistic that, it's a good first step. And, we're going to probably have to have some more other measures in place to incentivize manufacturing here. But at least we're finally heading in the right direction.
Robbie, I'm going to give you 30 seconds, then I'll give Ellen 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I have talked about, as I say, minerals to markets, but it ultimately does start with the market, right? That we need consumer demand. We have to drive that. And when that consumer demand happens, yes, the economic engine of supply chains will come. And then you need that team sport to make sure they're developing in the right places through some of that support. But ultimately, I do think that we need to show a maturity from that mine and into the processing. Because unless we do that and we just say, oh, we've opened this big battery facility and that's fine, we will then in the end regret it when something like what's happening now happens again with semiconductors. So to me, it's that team sport and thinking through the entire supply chain. But it does start with demand.
Thanks. And Ellen, closing comments.
Speaking of demand in the budget reconciliation, there are significant purchase incentives for electric vehicles. We need to, again, get everyone, hopefully in this audience, on board to support the bipartisan infrastructure deal. It's got a lot of battery support. It has charging station build out. And in budget reconciliation, we have purchase incentives, support for manufacturers to retool, a loan programs office, funding. Let's just get on board and get this done. And then I think we'll have a brighter future.
Thank you, Ellen, Robbie, John. Excellent discussion. I think it's pretty clear we all think we need a very holistic approach to this. Look at it from end to end if we're going to have the resilient supply chains of the future. Thank you all.